Hey there, my name is Frances Scott, and I wanted to share with you a quick story. It's my story, and I'll tell you where it led me. Uh, I was a news anchor for 20 years, enjoyed it very much, young family, great life, and I had some chronic pain and ended up at the age of 39 being told I needed to have both hips replaced. Actually, I was told at 38. I researched for a year and finally decided, based on seeing 12 different surgeons, 11 of them said, yep, you need to have both your hips replaced. I was a runner and a dancer, pretty active as a person all throughout my life. And so they said, look, you've just worn out your hips early and you're going to have to replace them or you'll be in pain forever. So I bit the bullet, I got it done and ended up worse. And nobody really had any answers for me about why I wasn't doing well. I developed all these other symptoms, ringing in the ears, hallucinating, sores all over my face and head and upper body. They told me it was acne. I was like, well, I've had acne. It didn't hurt like this. So basically, I ended up finding out after years of investigating, once the doctors, just kind of shrugged their shoulders and were done with me, I realized I was on my own. And the hips that I had gotten, made by Johnson & Johnson, the DePuy Pinnacle, had been in that period of time taken off the market. The company said it was, poor demand, which is why they weren't going to sell them anymore. So I realized I was on my own. I wasn't right. I was acting crazy. I had these, I'd call them like PTSD, like rage bursts that were really kind of uncharacteristic for me until the hips. So I knew something was wrong with my brain and I didn't know exactly what it was. So I quit all the drugs they had me on. I never took anything, beyond what they prescribed, but they had put me back on opioids and said, if you don't take these, you'll be in pain forever. Your nervous system has learned that pain is normal. So it's detecting pain where there is no pain. So you have to take this. And I was like, I don't want to. And they're like, well, you're going to hurt forever. So I took them. But I thought maybe the meds were making me, I thought I was becoming either schizophrenic, bipolar, or it was the meds or possibly something related to the hips. And everybody said, no, that could not be not be the case. So I quit all the meds and I was still having hallucinations, radical insomnia, the tinnitus, the mood, behavior, and personality changes. And so I started investigating and I ended up going to sit in on two bellwether trials. They were test cases related to other people's civil litigation against the company that made my hips, J&J, DePuy. And I ended up finding out that a lot of the research used to promote the safety and the efficacy of the hips was basically fraud because on the stand, the people couldn't lie about what they had done. There were verdicts against the company in these two trials that I attended up in Dallas in 2017 and 2016, but the story never really got told. So I was kind of shocked. I had grown up totally believing in medicine. I had had a lot of surgeries at that point, and I was kind of prone to injury. Turns out maybe there's a connective tissue disorder going on, but I'd never had a bad experience with medicine. My stepdad, who raised me, was an OBGYN oncology surgeon. I had had tons of surgery, never a problem until this hip replacement surgery. And in fact, I grew up reading medical journals because that's just kind of all we had laying around the house. It was the 80s and we didn't have cable and we didn't have the internet or cell phones or anything. So sometimes, all that's sitting there is a medical journal. I didn't really understand them all, but I would read them out of curiosity. So I had a familiarity with the literature. And when I went to court and I learned that some of the literature was based in absolute scientific fraud, and the researchers had been admonished by the FDA, but then the study was still sitting out there in a published medical journal, and the doctors who were reading it didn't understand or had no way of finding out that it was fraud. The only reason I found out is because I was sitting in these trials, and I was like, oh my gosh. So that's what led me to start to wonder, well, what are the chances that I just stumbled into the one time the science was done this way? And so, I'm curious and I couldn't help it. I started learning about Vioxx. I started, learning about Risperdal and a lot of the different drugs. The Morcelator is a device that was bad. I went to lobby for medical device safety and learned about Essure and this abdominal mesh or GYN mesh that they put in women and occasionally men for hernias, and it was, falling apart in people. And I learned that a lot of people feel like at least half of the published studies are basically rooted in fraud, or they're deceptive, or they're just marketing. They're not really good studies. So that blew my mind. I was absolutely devastated. I went to the FDA to talk about this metal that, had been used, this metal alloy that had been used to make my hips. Turns out it was toxic. It was cardiotoxic. It was neurotoxic. It was toxic to the tissue around the implants. People were finding out that they had destruction of the tissue around the implant, because it's basically like metal dust, metal debris. If you've ever gotten a metal splinter, you understand the tissue doesn't like it. Plus, we think I might have been allergic to the nickel in the alloy. So the alloy was cobalt, chromium, nickel, molybdenum, and I was highly reactive to at least one of those metals. So my body didn't like it. But in addition, the wear debris that was being created and the debris that was being created, a microscopic debris from what turned out to be corrosion, was getting into my bloodstream, damaging my heart, causing cardiomyopathy. We did an echocardiogram. It showed my heart tissue in the septum and the left ventricular wall were turning to scar tissue. And we think at this point that my brain was swelling due to the metals in my bloodstream. So I finally got the hips taken out, got better, went to the FDA to complain about, hey, this metal shouldn't be used. It's toxic. I wasn't warned. Also, you should be telling doctors to test their patients for metal hypersensitivities before they give them one of these products. This was at the end of 2019. And I had also gone to DC with a lot of the medical device safety advocates, people who were hurt by medical devices, and were trying to get improved safety for medical devices. And when I went to Congress, I realized, wow, okay, everybody's already taken a side. And about 85% of the people in Congress at the time had gotten a significant amount of money from the pharmaceutical industry. So that's how I learned that, the FDA was essentially purchased by pharma because of something called user fees, that years ago the drug companies went to the FDA and said, we want to help you. You're not getting our stuff to market fast enough. So we're going to give you all this money. And with the money came a huge stack of what the industry would expect in return, like, specific things that it wanted in return for this money. So I realized the FDA was captured by pharma. I realized that most of our members of Congress were captured by pharma, and I was absolutely devastated. I came home and I was so sad, realizing, hey, I learned this horrible thing, but there was nothing I was going to be able to do to potentially stop it from happening to other people. And that was my goal. I really was like, oh my gosh, I don't want this to happen to anyone else, because it ruined my career, ruined my life, ruined my health. Chronic pain. My kids were little at the time. I have a great husband. Our kids were 6, and 4 when all this started, and I didn't actually get the toxic hips taken out of me until they were like 15, and 13. So it pretty much ruined most of their childhood, to have a mom who wasn't physically doing well, had some neurological issues, and was not acting like herself. So I really wanted to protect other people from having this happen. And though the company did take off one piece of the hip and they claimed, oh, we're not selling metal on metal hips anymore, when I got my hips removed, it turns out it wouldn't have mattered if I had had a different, the piece that they no longer sell anymore. I could have had a different piece, and I still would have had the toxicity issues, because when we had my explanted devices analyzed by Dartmouth, they found there was evidence of corrosion. So most of what was getting into my bloodstream, my heart, and my brain was caused by corrosion. So, you start to learn these things and you realize, wow, people know a lot more about science than I do, and they should know 2 dissimilar metals in a wet environment, especially if a person's allergic. On top of it, that makes the tissue around the implant more acidic. Therefore, the corrosion happens faster. So then COVID hit, and I had some questions. I already knew the science in many cases was fraud, and so I started really questioning what we were being told. I knew there was There were financial incentives for our regulators not to be regulating the way that I believe they should and the way a lot of people think they should. So I had a little part-time job at the time and something I could do in spite of the pain that I had and mobility issues. And I was really happy to have that job. And thanks to the lockdowns, it went away. So I had nothing to do. I literally, we were all locked down here in Austin, Texas, and I essentially our pools closed, and the pools were the lifeline to my getting out of pain. I would go water walk in the pools all the time. Austin closed all the pools, so I had nothing to do. I ordered a blow-up pool and set it up in my backyard behind the garage, and I would just go back there and read studies, the early studies about COVID. And by then I had just found out about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I think I had seen one Gardasil video that he did maybe around 2014, and I thought it was interesting, but I wasn't a big fan. I wasn't really into what he did or his nonprofit Children's Health Defense. But because of COVID and because the movie Vaxxed, when I heard it got censored and kicked out of the Tribeca Film Festival, I was like, I'd never wanted to see it. But, when I hear something's been banned, as a former journalist, like, we don't typically believe in banning things. But I was like, well, what's so bad that I can't see it? So I watched that. That made an impression. And I noticed that Kennedy was being censored. And, his posts were getting taken down off Instagram, Facebook during COVID. And I thought, well, that's not right. So I started paying more attention to what he was saying. And, he was listed, as a conspiracy theorist, a disinformation spreader, as were a lot of other people. So I started looking into what they were saying, and I started going to PubMed, pulling the actual studies that they mentioned. And I did notice, what I was seeing on TV, they wouldn't quote their sources. They wouldn't give us the paper that was the basis for what they were saying. Same thing with Fauci and a lot of, Francis Collins, Deborah Birx, a lot of the governmental leaders, they would just make statements, but they would never give attribution like, oh, we know because of this study that, the 6-foot distance, is going to be helpful. And so I started listening to what Kennedy and some of the other disinformation spreaders were saying, and I was trying to catch them in a lie. And basically I spent an entire summer, maybe part of the fall of 2020, trying to catch, especially Kennedy, in any fabrication, exaggeration, lies, because he doesn't quote the source every time, but a lot of the times he does. And sometimes, you just start to learn, oh, when he says that, he's talking about that study, because I remembered from an earlier time when he had quoted a source. So I'd go look up the source, and I'd go read the paper for myself. And I'd realize he wasn't lying. That's how I learned that he was the one telling the truth, and that a lot of times the people who are telling the truth, a truth that's not convenient for the pharmaceutical industry or maybe some other agenda, those are the people that get written off as liars. So that's what led me to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I realized he was telling the truth. I realized he was not a quack, a nut job, all of the things that people say about him. He was just somebody who had stumbled into this huge disaster too, and had decided not to back down for it, even though it was not in his best interest to go forward and fight, for these people who were harmed by, or their children were harmed by, the pharmaceutical industry. So I myself, having been one who was, basically I had my entire 40s destroyed. I was a wreck, and we're still rebuilding from it. But thankfully, it led me to realizing that I could not, and we should not, just blindly trust sometimes what our doctors are saying and what the pharmaceutical industry is saying, or even what the medical journals are saying. A lot of times the doctors don't understand that they're being lied to in the medical journals. When I was in trial and I had my holy cow moment, and I, was listening to the researcher explaining how, like, he was doing a study and it was supposed to be a consecutive addition of patients, and he was just going to look at how they were all doing after they got a hip. And the plaintiff's attorney was like, well, what about this woman? Patient number, blah, 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 blah. And he said, she died after she got the hip, but you threw her out of the study. And the researcher said, oh, well, we expected people to die. We were only looking for adverse events that we didn't expect. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So when I had that moment, when I just realized, wow, like, sometimes there are sins of omission, sometimes it's obfuscation. Sometimes it's just a little deception, a little twisting. You could take one word out of a study in the headline and it means something totally different. So at that point, I realized, wow, I looked around, in court beside me. There were lots of people from the DOJ, but there were no other reporters there. And I wasn't really a reporter at that moment. I was just trying to figure out, are these things bad or good? Like I went to trial to figure out if they were bad enough that I should take the radical step of having both hips replaced for a second time. It was a really big deal to me because it hadn't gone well the first time. So, like, I wasn't just going to jump into a revision, which is when they take out the old hips and they put in new ones. Plus, I know that every time you get a revision, you lose a little bit more bone. And after a while, after a couple revisions, like, you can't have 5 revisions in a lifetime. And if the things only last, X amount of time, well, I'm going to get to the point where I can't have any, the old hip's worn out, it's not working, I'm in pain, and I can't get a new one. So that's why I ended up driving to Dallas to sit in on those trials and learn the truth. And I looked around, no one's covering it. And I thought, well, what doctor's going to have 4 months to take off from his practice and drive to some other city and sit in on these trials? They weren't televised. There's nowhere you can, there are no cameras in court. So there's no way you can find this out for yourself. So I thought, wow, like, the doctors don't know they're being lied to sometimes in the medical journals. And when it came to products considered vaccines, I learned, well, gosh, the people who believe they were harmed by vaccines are not even allowed to sue the company directly since 1986. Sure, they can file a claim with the program that's supposed to handle all this stuff, but that's a government program. There's no discovery, and discovery is the part of time in the legal process when you filed a lawsuit, when the real jewels get dug up, so to speak. So that's when attorneys can dig through, emails and what's considered eventually the evidence, and that's where they find the smoking guns. So I realized, with no ability to sue directly vaccine makers, nobody ever finds out the type of stuff like what I found out sitting in on those trials. It just never, the confidential emails, the company proprietary things, the way the studies were manipulated, that never comes out with products that are specifically labeled vaccines. Also in COVID, I read, not the J&J, but the Janssen was working on a COVID vaccine, as you know, but I read the Moderna and Pfizer trial design documents. I don't remember how I found them. They were about 100 pages each. But I realized that they weren't even looking into the researchers weren't even being told, hey, find out if this product stops transmission or prevents death or reduces hospitalizations. But the question being asked in the initial studies was, does this product, when a person gets COVID, does it reduce their symptoms by 1 or more symptoms? And I thought, well, that's not what the headlines were implying when they came out with the 95% effective. You have to say effective at doing what? And I knew that from all my years of reading medical journals and scientific research, just out of fun, or when I was a kid or teenager, or when trying to figure out if I needed the hips. I started to kind of be able to understand, not as well obviously as a doctor or a researcher, but I could understand what I was reading in the journals. And so I then began to look into Moderna, and I had learned from my hip journey and researching the Pinnacle Hip, Johnson & Johnson, DePuy. I had somehow picked up along the way that it's in the SEC filings when you figure out the truth, because there are very specific laws that tell the people running publicly traded companies, if you lie to your shareholders or do anything that risks their investment, then they have legal grounds for a claim. So they don't deceive as much, from what I can tell, in their SEC filings. So I pulled up Moderna's what are called 10K filings from like 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and I read those. And the same thing for Pfizer. I pulled up on SEC.gov. I read their 10K documents. 100 pages, incredibly boring. But again, you find the minutia in there, and that's where I found that in the US, and they disclosed to their shareholders, hey, in the US, mRNA products are considered gene therapies. And so I was like, okay, they're deceiving us about that as well. They're not disclosing that. I also find out that in Moderna's 10K filings, first of all, years and years and years of being in the red, yet everybody's still investing in this company. And I'm like, So when you get down to a certain point in the 10K filing, you see Moderna disclose to its shareholders, hey, our major stakeholders are DARPA and BARDA. Well, DARPA is a division of the Department of Defense. BARDA is a division of the NIH. And I'm like, Moderna is the government's horse in this race. It's the way that the government is going to be making money from the sale of this company's product. So also Pfizer, it discloses that its major stakeholders are Gates affiliated, Bill Gates affiliated and invested companies, other pharmaceutical companies, Vertex and other. And I thought, man, it sounds just like BlackRock. Like they're all like invested in each other, and they all. I mean, it just seemed like something I didn't want a part of. So anyway, all that led me to Kennedy, and a couple years in, maybe it was 2023, my husband said, look, I mean, you're obviously passionate about this. And I was feeling better at that point after my revision. And he said, why don't you go work for the campaign? So I eventually, reached out. I don't think I ever found anyone in the campaign, but I saw the Kennedy Beacon had posted a piece saying we're hiring. And so I applied, and the rest is history. But that's how I ended up working and trying to help the process of getting Robert F. Kennedy Jr. elected, and also just to amplify what he's been saying, because when people really look into it, I'm lucky that I actually, ironically, because of losing my job as a news anchor and my career, my reputation was trashed through all this because I wasn't acting like myself. And so what do you think when somebody's had a big surgery and then they come back acting crazy? Well, I mean, oh yeah, opioid. It's got to be opioid addiction. So, it was a reasonable assumption. It didn't happen to be true, but, it turned out to be encephalopathy or brain swelling. But because of that, and because of chronic pain, and then the pain when I got the revision, there was a problem in revision. I got one of the side effects that can happen, and it left me back in pretty high pain after that. So I couldn't be on my feet as much as I wanted to, and because of that, I had the time and I had the interest to really dig into all this stuff. Most people, I understand, don't have the time to look into it, don't want to look into it, don't have any real reason not to trust, and so they don't. So I feel fortunate now, even though the disaster that happened because of the hips in my 40s, it prepared me to learn and understand and really be open to what I was seeing in the medical journals and contrast that with what I had seen in the news. Also, during COVID, I still had friends in the news, and a lot of them were in different markets by then, because you meet at one station and then so-and-so gets a job there and so-and-so gets a job there. So as a result, you end up with friends kind of all over the nation. And because by then, and some of the postings I had done on Facebook and YouTube, I'd kind of become known as somebody who was really critical of pharma. So when COVID hit, people who were still working in the news reached out to me, and they're like, hey, we're seeing this. Like, I'm not being able to do this story. I'm being suddenly told there are stories I can't do and copy I can't change. And it really confused a lot of my friends. So they were reaching out to me saying, we're not, suddenly something's changed in March of 2020. And so that too was kind of a red flag for me. Also a little sidebar here. When the government came out and said, you can't use this medication to treat that illness, meaning, either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin or budesonide or some of the ones that, some doctors were piping up saying, hey, I'm seeing we have something that worked on a couple people, or, all my patients or half my patients, whatever they were saying. I saw those videos taken down off YouTube in almost real time. That was stunning. But then I also knew from growing up with my stepfather, I mean, he used birth control pills to help people with acne. He used different drugs to help people with migraines. Now, these drugs weren't approved for those purposes, but it's called off-label prescribing. And so I knew that the moment when the government said you can't use A drug for B illness, doctors had never been told that before. I mean, yeah, the company can't advertise, hey, this drug is good for this problem unless there had been the clinical trials. But you can, doctors have the right, anything that's on the market, and these types of drugs have been on the market many years. They can use anything for anything, and they all know that. So I thought this should have been a red flag to all physicians. They should have known at that point, don't use this drug for this problem. It's like, wait, we've never been told that before. So there were so many anomalies in the whole COVID thing that, I really slowly put it together on my own, and with a couple of my friends. We would share stuff, other people who were hurt by medical devices, and finally figured it out. And that's why I realized Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is telling the truth. Our pharma industry is out of control. Our medical journals, most medical journals are bought. There have been medical journal editors who were multi-year, even a decade-long medical journal editors who then write books. Marcia Engel is one of the people that's written a book and says, we can't trust about half of what gets published in our scientific journals. So that's how I found Kennedy, and that's why I want him to be president, because he does need to wrangle. I mean, I may not agree with every single position he has on every issue, but he's the only one saying this industry is out of control and we have to bring them back in. But in addition, as a mom now of a 20-year-old son, an 18-year-old son, and a 20-year-old daughter, I'm really concerned about all of the warmongering that our country is involved in. And I really want someone who will say, both to the pharmaceutical industry and to the defense/war industry, hey, I don't care how big a business it is. Like, this isn't right. We don't hurt people just to make money. So, yeah, that's go Kennedy. That's my hope.